Let's kind of think about changes and continuities in peasant agricultural labor. If we look directly at the key concepts, which you see here from the College Board, traditional peasant agriculture is going to increase and change. Part of that is because we see a demand for what is produced increase, global demand for raw materials, finished products. And so the ultimate change we see is that peasant labor intensifies in many regions. And so that's kind of our first big change. I want to just kind of do a quick question here, something we're going to cover here in just a second, but make sure that people are kind of involved, paying attention. Which of the following countries used peasant labor to expand its empire by settling outlying territories? So look at this question, look at your answer choices, give it a shot, not the end of the world if you get it wrong. So let's see what the answer is going to be momentarily. Let's start first with changes. And it is that idea that peasant agriculture intensified. And one thing that we see with peasant agriculture is that it's going to intensify pretty much everywhere. One of the results was that the Columbian Exchange occurs, right? And the biospheres of the Eastern and Western hemisphere become much more homogeneous. We see foodstuffs moving back and forth. In Afro-Eurasia, that meant that with a more diverse diet and foods that are a little bit easier to grow, populations skyrocket. You can see here in this chart, looking at continental Europe and China as just two examples, that between 1450 and 1600, populations blow up. Well, a higher population needs more food, and certainly that is predominantly grown by peasant agriculture. So one reason for the intensification of this peasant labor, if that is your change in an essay that you're writing about, and you're wanting to explain why this peasant agriculture intensifies in places like China or England or Europe, it would be because there was a greater demand for food, or perhaps because new foodstuffs were introduced to Europe, allowing for population growth, thus needing more agriculture. Now, that's just kind of a general one, kind of keeping in mind that peasant agriculture is going to increase, but there are three specific examples in the key concepts that we want to make sure to cover. And I'm going to keep referring to those because since they're in there, in the key concepts, they're more likely to be asked on your test or be more likely covered in a document or a source that you would see on your test. So first, let's start in China, where peasant labor wasn't just used to farm rice or crops that were introduced from the Americas. In China, we also see, as a result of the increase in trade that's going on in the world, a demand for Chinese goods, particularly silk, of course. That is kind of the dominant Chinese good throughout history, silk along with porcelain. But in China, because of this high demand for silk by Europeans, and also because the Chinese wanted to gobble up the silver that was flowing in across the Pacific from the Spanish Americas into China, they took peasants, right, and they moved them from perhaps rice farming and other modes of agriculture production into silk production. And so China ramps up silk production by using peasants to meet this demand. And that is one example of this intensification of peasant labor. So these Chinese peasants are there to cultivate these, and then, of course, to conduct the silk process. You can see that in the image here, to spin the silk, and then, of course, eventually it goes out into the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean. Europeans take it, and then they, do what Europeans do with silk, wear it, I guess. Another example of this we see in Mughal India. Now, with trade, trade in the early modern period has its ups and downs, right? In general, we see an intensification of trade, but depending on the commodity, prices go up and down. And in Mughal India in this time period, there was a lull or so, or a decline in the price of spices. Now, of course, the trade of spices was one of the most important aspects of global trade. It was one of the reasons why Europeans wanted to move into the Indian Ocean. But with the decline in the price of spices, there was a subsequent, or a kind of an opposite thing happening with cotton. Europeans had fallen in love with this new fabric, the fabric of our lives, some might say. And a major source for this fabric at this point in history, in the early modern period, is India. So with the rise in the prices of cotton because of the demand for it, Mughal India starts to transition peasants and force them into the production of cotton within India. This can be seen kind of in these images too. One of the kind of more, I think the term might be, I don't know, upscale. I'm not, again, not a scientist, not a fashion guru here. One of the forms cotton takes is as muslin, which is this kind of thin, very soft form of cotton. On the left there in the image, you can see a woman in India wearing this fabric. And on the right, Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, who loses her head, wearing her own cotton gown. So this was in high demand, this cotton was. And because of it, and because of the prices this cotton fetched, Mughal India shifts peasant labor into cotton production, again, intensifying it in that specific region. Another change that takes place in labor, specifically peasant labor. And then the last one for these examples is seen in Russia. And this is the answer to the question you had earlier. So if you chose A, you were correct. In Russia, we see that in that country, the government uses peasant farmers not just to grow plants that can house caterpillars to create silk, or not just to grow cotton, but they actually use it as a tool to settle Eastern territory, a tool to settle Siberia, in fact. The government encouraged this peasant agriculture, these peasant farmers, to settle in Siberia. They encouraged them by giving them seeds to plant, giving them grain to feed themselves, providing them with tools. And this was part of Russia's imperial expansion to the east. So there's the answer to your question. And that wraps up some of the changes that we see in peasant agricultural labor, particularly the intensification of it. Now, what's change without continuity? So I want to briefly talk about this, although, as I said, oftentimes continuities are mundane, and sometimes it just depends how you frame your change of continuity, depending on where you might put it. So in terms of thinking of a continuity with peasant agricultural labor, for the most part, if we think about peasant labor at all, it is still the dominant form of labor in pre-industrial society. This is something that is certainly kind of worth noting. Even though we have trading taking place across the world, most people are still poor farmers. Like, that doesn't really change much in the modern era. There's a lot of things that change in world history, but for the most part, the poor farmers are still going to be a poor farmer, whether or not they're serfs or free agricultural labor. So in Europe, for example, we're going to continue to see peasant farmers. Perhaps their station has changed as feudalism declines and dies out, and we start to see free peasant farmers, especially after the Black Death has changed the landscape of Europe. We've already seen in India, in China, this peasant agricultural labor, saw it in Russia. So that is going to continue in this time period. And that's ultimately kind of some changes and continuities that we see in this one aspect of labor.